The snow had already begun to fall by the time the pain overtook her. It wasn't a slow, ceremonial flurry that danced down like lace, but a thick, driving storm that swept through Aldervale with vengeance, churning the sky into a blind white sheet and swallowing the edges of the world. Maris crouched beneath the vestry floorboards, her knees pressed into the cold earth, her fingers gripping the damp hem of her shift as another wave tore through her spine and belly. Her breath came in uneven gasps, frosting the dark air in front of her face, and the cry that escaped her mouth was half muted by the cracked wooden boards above. Outside, the bells of midnight mass tolled faintly in the distance, their echoes bouncing between stone walls and snow-drifted lanes, calling the village to worship. No one heard her scream. No one knew she was there. She had come to church out of desperation, not faith. In the final weeks of her pregnancy, with her stomach a hard, unwieldy moon and her cheeks hollowed by shame and hunger, Maris had clung to the idea that the vestry, abandoned for years except during burial rites, might still offer a roof, if not refuge. She'd slipped into the back, past the rotting chapel pews and the rusted altar cross, and found a space just wide enough for her body beneath the raised floor. No fire, no blankets, only a patchwork of wool shawls and the narrow, silent determination that she must survive. The child, or what she thought was a single child, was coming early. There had been no midwife, no salt water, no hands but her own. She had bitten down on her own arm to keep from crying out again. Her thighs trembled with the force of holding herself upright, of bearing down without breaking. Her vision blurred, blood pooled beneath her, warm and sudden, and she thought for a moment that she might die there, curled like an animal under the bones of forgotten church. But then a cry, a small, sharp wail, pierced through the pain. One, then another. Two voices, shrill and breathless, overlapping like wind through winter branches. She stared down at the impossible sight in her arms. Two infants, slick with birth and squirming against her chest, and the weight of it hit her all at once. Twins. For a long time, she could do nothing but weep, not the gentle, dignified weeping of women in candlelit parlors, but an ugly, trembling sob that came from somewhere ancient and buried, as if her own mother were crying through her. Twins. A bad omen. A curse. No one in Aldervale would bless them. Superstition ran deep here, tangled like roots in every hearth and cradle. Two babes born to an unwed woman, without witness, without a husband to claim them. She knew what the village would see. Not life, but proof of sin. The father had left before her belly began to swell. A herald from the southern courts, sweet-tongued and swift to vanish, who had whispered poetry against her neck and promised he would return before the frost. He never did. By morning, she wrapped the twins in strips of torn linen and crept from the vestry with them pressed to her chest. She did not go to her family. Her mother had died 3 winters ago, and her father's only remaining warmth was buried in the bottle he drank from night and day. Her sister had married into a trader's home in the next village and never answered Maris's letters. There was no kin left who would shelter her. She walked instead toward the heart of Aldervale, toward the square and its iron well, hoping perhaps that someone, anyone, might see her as a mother and not a warning. Snow clung to her skirts, her hair, her lashes. The world felt like a hush that might never lift. They saw her before she spoke. The baker's wife turned first, clutching her own child tighter to her hip. Then the butcher's apprentice, who once flirted with Maris behind the slaughterhouse, stepped backward as if her presence burned. Words didn't come easily. She tried to say that she needed milk, cloth, a place by a fire. But before her mouth could form the syllables, Father Burin stepped from the chapel doors, flanked by 2 altar boys. His eyes were hard, his jaw a slab of stone beneath his beard. He did not ask where she had been. He did not ask who the father was. He simply raised his hand, and in a voice as smooth and final as a closing gate, said, "Unclean." The word rang out like a curse. A woman behind Maris gasped. A man spit into the snow. One of the altar boys whispered something and crossed himself. The twin stirred in her arms, sensing the fear in her limbs, the way her feet had gone numb not just from the cold, but from the sudden absence of ground beneath her. She wanted to protest, to plead, but her voice had been buried too long in silence. And somewhere deep down, she had known this moment was coming, that there was no miracle for girls like her, no place in the order of things for women who broke the rules and lived to tell it. A constable approached her with hesitation, not cruelty, as if her touch might summon illness. He told her she was to leave the village by sundown, that the twins were not recognized by name or law, that to stay was to bring misfortune on all who lived under God's grace. She did not fight. She simply nodded and turned back the way she had come, each step heavier than the last. Behind her, a door slammed. A child began to cry. The snow fell without pause. She wandered beyond the edge of the village, past the riverbank where she had once kissed a boy under the elder tree, past the charred remains of the weaving house where her mother had worked, past a line of frost-covered graves where she had once lit a candle for a brother who died young. The road narrowed into a path, and the path vanished into forest. Snow turned the trees into pillars of silence. The only sound was the rustle of the twins as they shifted against her chest, seeking warmth. Somewhere, hours later, she couldn't have said where, she found the remains of Forrester's shack, barely more than 4 walls and a slanted roof patched with moss and rot. The door creaked open, unresisting, and the scent of old pine smoke clung faintly to the rafters. She stepped inside and sank to the floor, clutching the twins to her body as if the closeness alone could shield them from the storm. They didn't cry much those first hours, as if they, too, sensed a need for silence. One nestled beneath her chin, tiny mouth rooting gently for her skin, while the other stared up at the beams above, wide-eyed and eerily still. She named the first Elias for mercy and the second one for the quiet. Names spoken aloud only to the shadows. Names they would carry like fragile lamps through a world already trying to snuff them out. That night, she didn't sleep. She watched the snow slip through cracks in the roof, felt the cold settle into her bones, and whispered promises she didn't know if she could keep. That they would live, that she would not let them be taken, that even if the world had thrown them away like spoiled bread, she would carve out a place for them, however small, however bitter, and call it home. She pressed her lips to each of their foreheads and tried to remember the sound of a lullaby. All she could summon was a rhythm of a loom, the thud and pull of her mother's weaving, and so she hummed that instead, again and again, until it became a song. The wind wailed outside like something grieving, but inside, 3 heartbeats moved in fragile harmony. And for that one night, the world did not end. It merely began again, in exile, in silence, in snow. The shack stood crooked in the cradle of a pine hollow, its bones weathered by wind and time, its chimney long collapsed, its door hanging askew on one rusted hinge. It had been a forester's place once, perhaps decades ago, before the blight came to the valley and the timber merchants abandoned their routes. But whatever purpose it once held had long since rotted into memory. The roof was patched with moss and fallen branches, the floor uneven with dirt and stone, and the walls groaned in every breeze as though sighing through old pain. Yet to Maris, who arrived beneath its shelter with her 2 infant sons swaddled in shawls made from her own hemmed skirts, it was a cathedral compared to the open cold of the woods. It did not promise warmth, but it promised enclosure, and that, in the brunt of winter's rain, was enough to count as mercy. She spent the first day gathering what little could be salvaged from the ruin. There was an overturned cot in the corner. It was splintered, but still whole enough to hold the babies if lined with cloth and tucked into the warmest part of the room. A rusted kettle lay beneath a shattered cabinet, and she unearthed it with careful hands, scraping out the dead leaves and beetles before placing beside a low stone hearth where a fireplace had once been. There was no wood inside, no cold, but the forest was dense and the snow had not yet turned to ice. With a makeshift sling tied around her shoulders, she placed both boys against her chest, one to each side, and trudged out into the pines with a small knife and a prayer. She didn't go far. The snow muffled sound and bent light until everything around her became uncertain. Shapes blurred, colors dulled, and the usual markers of the forest vanished in a blanket of white and shadow. She kept her eyes low, scanning for branches fallen from the weight of frost, and when she found a cluster of dried twigs beneath a bent spruce, she gathered them quickly, wrapping them in the hem of her skirt. The babies stirred but did not cry. They were warm against her, alive and quiet, which filled her with an awe that was laced with terror. Any wrong choice could end them. A night too cold, a cough left unattended, a meal too thin. She was not ready. But readiness was not a thing the world granted her. It demanded everything before she had time to prepare. Back in the shack, she worked without pause. She tore the lining from her coat to insulate the cradle and broke down a broken chair for kindling. She stacked the twigs, lit a fire with flint she found in a jar under the cabinet, and nursed a flame with dry breath and shivering fingers until it caught. Smoke poured into the room through the broken chimney. So she cracked a gap in the roof with the handle of her knife and hoped the wind would carry the smoke away. It did mostly. The fire was small, just enough to warm the stones around it and take the edge off the cold. But as night descended again and the forest darkened into a silent cathedral of shadows, that small circle of warmth became the center of their world. She slept lightly, wrapped around the twins, her hand always resting on their chest to feel for breath. When they stirred, she fed them by instinct, pulling them to her breast beneath her shawl, singing wordless melodies half remembered from her childhood. Their bodies were light as sparrows, fragile and red-cheeked, and they clung to her like ivy to stone. In those first nights, time became something slow and cyclical, marked not by clocks or bells, but by the rhythm of survival. The need for heat, for quiet, for the next breath, the next drop of milk. She named the hours by the moon's position and the ache in her bones. The fire needed constant tending, the boys constant touch. There was no room for thought beyond them. By the end of the first week, she had learned how to make snow drinkable by boiling it with pine needles. She learned where the deer left tracks near the glade and where the ice was too thin to trust. She fashioned diapers from wool scraps and washed them in melted snow, hanging them near the fire on a line of twine pulled from an old hunting bough she found buried beneath a tarp. Her hands cracked from cold and use. Her lips bled. Her stomach ached from hunger more days than not. But the babies were growing. Slowly, Elias cried in his sleep, but smiled when awake, a smile that crinkled the edges of his round eyes and made Maris's chest twist with something too wide to name. Flynn was quieter. He watched her, watched the flickering fire, watched the empty corners of the room with an intensity that unnerved her. He rarely fussed, and when he did, it was brief and breathy, as though he knew not to take up more space than necessary. She loved them both with the ferocity of someone who had no one else. One night, while rocking Elias to sleep, she heard a sound just beyond the shack, a rustling that didn't match the usual sway of branches or call of birds. She froze, body tensed, and held her breath. The rustling came again. Slow, deliberate. Her heart began to thud. She reached for her knife, placing Elias back in the cot beside Fun, and moved to the door. It took everything in her not to tremble. She peeked to the gap in the wall, expecting a scavenger, a fox, maybe even a wolf. Instead, she saw a doe, lame in one leg, with a coat dusted in frost and eyes that glowed faintly in the moonlight. The creature stared back at her for a long moment, then lowered its head to graze on the dead grass beneath a snowless patch of earth. It did not flee. It stayed there until dawn, and Maris, too stunned to sleep, watched it until the light returned. She began to see the doe often after that. It never came close in the tree line, but lingered near the shack's clearing, as if guarding it, or perhaps simply recognizing another living being pushed to the edge of survival. Maris came to think of it as her sentinel. In the hardest hours of night, when both boys were crying and the fire would not light, she would look toward the window and hope to catch a glimpse of it standing there, stoic and strange. Its presence reminded her she was not entirely alone, even if no human soul dared come near. As winter wore on, she began to barter what she could. She ventured into the outer edge of Aldervale, cloaked and hooded, and left stitched goods, wool socks, patch mittens, a child bonnet, on the stoop of an herbalist known for her silence. In return, she would find small bundles of dried food, tallow, once even a glass jar of goat's milk. There were no words exchanged, no glances. It was a trade rooted in unspoken need. The villagers still whispered her name, still crossed themselves when they heard her footsteps on the outer road, but few understood what it meant to survive outside Grace. And from those few came lifelines, quiet and conditional. The twins grew with the hunger of all things born into hardship. Elias was first to crawl, reaching always for the light. whether it came from the fire, a shaft of sun, or the moon's reflection in a pool of thawed snow. Finn followed days later, not with the same urgency but with more precision, choosing his moments as if weighing the risks in every motion. Maris taught them words the way a weaver threads a loom, slowly, patiently, in repetition. "Fire," she said, touching their small hands to the stone. "Sky," she whispered as they looked upward from her lap. "Mama," she breathed when they reached for her, and the first time Elias said it back, it undid something inside her so completely she had to turn away and cry. Spring did not arrive so much as relent. The snow melted in fits, exposing the earth in dark bruises of mud. The shack smelled of wet bark and ash. With warmer days came the scent of pine resin and thawed moss, and the forest changed shape, became less like a grave and more like a cradle. Maris ventured further, gathered wild leeks and sorrel, caught glimpses of fox kits tumbling in the bracken. Still, she did not return to the village. She did not want to risk the boys. Instead, she planted roots here, not in soil but in memory. Every step she took was mapped by their laughter, their cries, the way they curled against her when frightened. This was the life she had now, not chosen perhaps, but forged, day by day, breath by breath, in the hollow pines where shame had once banished her, but motherhood had taught her how to stay. By the time Elias could run the length of the clearing without falling, and could climb the crooked pine beside the shack with the patience of a cat, Maris had become known, if not welcomed, in the outskirts of Alder Vale. The years had passed in a rhythm too slow to feel like motion, but too steady to call stillness. There was no calendar on her wall, no marked dates, no candles for birthdays. She measured time in the length of the boys' arms, in the sound of their voices changing pitch, in the way her own hands grew coarser with each season. Life, once a fragile wood flickering against wind and hunger, had settled into a quiet endurance, and in that stillness, she began to trade. Not coin for goods, but skill for survival. A spool of thread became as valuable as bread. A well-mended sleeve could barter for a loaf, a patched satchel for a dozen eggs. And so she became, in the eyes of a few cautious neighbors, the woman with strong fingers and no words, the one who stitched without question and left her payment in silence at dawn. Her first customer, if it could be called that, was a woodsman named Harlan who lived 3 bends down the frozen creek, closer to the game trails than to the church. He had brought her a boot split at the heel, wrapped in coarse wool, and left beside the stump she used for skinning bark. When she returned it 2 days later, the leather cleaned and stitched clean through with deer sinew. There was no note, no thanks, only a smoked trout nailed to a tree and a folded pair of woolen socks in a sack. It was enough. It became the beginning of a ritual, and others followed. Word passed not through conversation, but through the language of need. A hem left on a fence, a glove tucked into the crook of a tree. She never ventured deeper into the village, and no one came to her door. But in time, the forest itself became a thread that connected her to the world she had once been cast out from. The twins, now 5 and full of questions, began to notice the shape of their life as something different. Elias asked first, of course, his voice always a spear that pierced silence before it could thicken. "Why don't we go into town?" he asked one afternoon, his hands sticky with birch sap, his hair tangled from tumbling down the slope behind the shack. Other boys must live there. Where are they? Maris, seated at the door with a pair of torn breeches in her lap, did not look up. She finished threading her needle, tied a knot, and only then replied, "We belong to the trees. The town belongs to the stones. That is the way of it." Elias squinted, unconvinced. What if the trees missed the stones? She smiled faintly, a curve of her lips that held no amusement, but something softer, something almost reverent. Then they wait for the wind to carry stories between them. Finn didn't ask, not then. But he listened, always, and the way his gaze lingered on the ridge where the church bell could just be seen glinting in late sun told her he was beginning to wonder, too. Unlike his brother, Finn was content to observe rather than speak. He took to the woods with the quiet aptitude of shadow, learned to trap rabbits using simple twine snares, and once returned home with a small bundle of wild strawberries cupped in his dirt-streaked hands. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, and when he did, his words came slow, deliberate, as though chosen from a deeper place. Maris watched him sometimes and saw a reflection of herself at that age, watchful, wound tight with thoughts, never entirely at ease even in stillness. She had taught them to sew as soon as their fingers could grasp a needle, not out of tradition or sentiment but necessity. Elias took to it easily, his stitches uneven but enthusiastic, often embellishing seams with little loops and symbols he invented. Fun, however, was precise. Every line he stitched was straight, measured, done without waste. They made their own tunics from discarded cloth and worn linen scraps, dyed with walnut husks and beet juice, their clothing patched and mismatched but unmistakably theirs. Maris showed them how to tan hides, how to card wool, how to twist thread strong enough to bind a wound. Survival had no luxury for innocence, but she offered them wonder where she could, naming the stars by the stories her mother once told her, humming old ballads as they gathered kindling, carving birds into bits of wood to hang above their bed. Occasionally, someone from a village would see them, a shepherd passing by with his flock, a child gathering herbs near the brook, a merchant cutting through the woods on his way to the mountain pass. They never spoke, these villagers. Sometimes they stared. Sometimes they turned away. Once, a stone was thrown, missing Maris by inches. She didn't flinch. She only gathered the boys and led them home, silent, her spine straight, her eyes unreadable. She had long since ceased to expect anything from Aldervale but silence and suspicion. And yet, as the years deepened, some softened toward her in small, uncertain ways. The widow Brenna, whose own daughter had died in childbirth the same winter Maris was cast out, began leaving bundles of dried mint and chamomile near the path. She never appeared in person, but Maris knew the stitching of her thread, the careful twist of each herb wrap. In return, Maris left her a cloak one autumn, sewn from thick wool and lined with rabbit fur. It was gone the next day. No word passed between them, but the exchange meant more than coin ever could. There were other signs, too. Quiet gestures that hinted at a change not yet spoken aloud. A cord of firewood stacked near the edge of the clearing. A flask of oil left atop a stump. A loaf of rye bread wrapped in wax paper and tied with blue twine. These things appeared without explanation, without ownership, as if the forest itself had decided she had earned her place. Still, Maris kept her boundaries. She never entered the village. She never asked for more. Pride was not her reason. Fear was, but over time, it hardened into principle. If she could build a life with nothing, she would not owe them anything again. By the 7th year, Elias had become taller than the doorframe. He ran fast and laughed often, his joy louder than the trees. He began singing as he worked, lilting tunes with no origin, spinning lyrics about clouds and fireflies and the sound of pine cones falling on snow. Fun, now lean and sharp-eyed, had grown quieter still. He drew maps of the forest, marking where mushrooms grew and where deer slept, and once showed Maris a hidden glade where bluebells bloomed even in the first frost. Together, they began to shape the world around them into something sacred. Stones stacked in circles for rituals, branches bent to form hidden passageways, small totems carved into bark to ward off nightmares. Maris let them. She understood the need to make magic in a world that offered them no miracles. She still sewed, always, by moonlight, by firelight, with tired fingers and aching wrists. Her needlework grew more beautiful with each passing year, intricate with ivy patterns and feathered seams, garments that looked as if they belonged to lords and not exiles. Once, she fashioned a shawl so fine it shimmered in the sun like the wings of a moth. She left it near the village well, unsure if anyone would claim it. Weeks later, she saw it draped over the shoulders of the baker's wife during market. No one acknowledged where it had come from, but she saw the stitch along the hem, a mark known only to her, a pine branch cross over a needle sewn in pale gray thread. And so the years turned. The seasons bled into one another like colors in a slow-moving river, indistinguishable at the edges but deeply felt at the heart. Maris became a story whispered between doors, a name half remembered by children warned not to wander. Yet she endured, not in defiance but in devotion to her sons, to the fragile sanctuary she had built, to the belief that love, even cast out, could take root and bloom in the soil of survival. The forest did not ask her to forget who she was. It only asked that she stay. And so she did, threading her life together, one stitch at a time, until held against a world. The news arrived not like thunder, but like mist, slow, soundless, creeping through the trees until it settled on the skin. It began with strange hoof prints near the creek, heavier than the usual mule or ox, deep set and sharp as if shod with iron. Then came the smell of oil and smoke, not the dry scent of firewood, but something tar-thick, foreign. Birds fell silent. Even the deer grew scarce. Maris noticed a change before the boys did. She always did. The forest, once her silent accomplice, felt restless. The wind carried an edge of metal. The hush had changed pitch. She tried to dismiss it at first. Scouts sometimes passed through Aldervale on their way north, rarely stopping, always cloaked in indifference. But this was different. 3 mornings in a row, she found ashes near the path, blackened hoof prints melted into snow, and once, a torn bit of parchment with a wax seal that had been half trampled into the mud. She didn't read it. She didn't need to. The seal, a double-headed hawk flanked by laurels, belonged to the crown. It was a mark of summons, of orders, of presence. On the 4th day, while hanging linens to dry between 2 narrow birches, she heard voices, male, clipped, unfamiliar, not like the woodsmen or barterers she sometimes encountered, not like the cautious hush of villagers keeping their distance. These voices were formal, practiced, and too close. She turned toward the sound and instinctively stepped in front of the laundry line, shielding it as if the sight of her son's shirts could betray them. The boys were not far, gathering kindling near the blackberry bush that clung stubbornly to life even in the cold months. She called them without raising her voice. Inside, now. They heard the tone and obeyed without question. By the time the figures appeared at the edge of the clearing, Maris had already tucked the boys behind the hearth and stilled the fire. She stood in the doorway, arms folded, her expression unreadable. There were 2 of them, men in polished boots and woolen cloaks, swords at their hips, each bearing the same sigil on their shoulders, the crown. They were not local. Their posture alone betrayed their station. 2 upright, 2 clean, the sort of men who had never needed to drag a body from a snowdrift or sharpen a blade for skinning. One of them was young, almost boyish beneath the helm, with ruddy cheeks and eyes too quick to rest. The other was older, lean, with a voice that cut like a whetstone. "Are you Maris of Aldervale?" the elder asked, not unkindly but without invitation. She did not answer. Names, after all, were things once used to bind and exile her. She had learned to keep them close. "We've been sent to locate boys of a particular age and bearing," he continued, pulling a scroll from his side. "There is to be a census, a selection, the Queen's initiative, for court service, stewardship, education under the high tutors." Still she said nothing, though her throat clenched. Elias and Finn were now 11, tall for their age, sharp-eyed, articulate, with a bearing of children shaped not by privilege, but by the stern kindness of survival. There were no records of them in any ledger, no midwife signature, no baptism, no surname. They existed outside the crown's reach, until now. The younger scout looked past her into the shadows of the shack. "We heard there are children here, twin boys." Maris narrowed her eyes. "You've heard wrong. May we come in?" the older one asked, though his hand was already on the doorframe. No. There was a pause, not quite hostile, but tense in the way silence grows just before a storm. Then the younger man stepped forward and offered something she had not expected, a small loaf of bread, wrapped in cloth, still warm. "For them," he said, softer, "we don't mean harm." She did not take it. She didn't move at all. The older man sighed and returned the scroll to his satchel. "We'll return in 2 days. Think on it. This isn't a conscription. It's an offering, a chance for them to be more than this. More than this." The words burned, as if what they had built, brickless and bare, was not already more than anyone had allowed them. After they left, Elias emerged first. What did they want? Maris turned, eyes unreadable. "They're looking for boys to polish the Queen's silver." Elias snorted. "Why would she need that many?" Finn spoke quietly from behind the hearth. "They're not looking for silver polishers. She said nothing more that night, only watched them sleep, the curve of their bodies too long now for the cot she once rocked them in. The fire had burned low. Outside, wind scraped against the window pane like a warning. The next day, she packed quietly, not to flee. There was nowhere left untouched by the crown, but to prepare. If they were to return, she would meet them on her own terms. She stitched the boys' new shirts from her finest linen, reinforced the seams with thread dyed in blue, a color once reserved for noble birth. She braided her hair, something she hadn't done in years, and pulled from beneath the floorboard a carved box that smelled of lavender and dust. Inside was the only remnant of the twins' father, a silver ring etched with a symbol of the Southern Heralds. She had never shown it to them. She didn't plan to now, but she slipped it into her pocket as if it might carry weight in a world ruled by bloodlines and proof. That evening, she called the boys to her. They sat at her feet like they had as children, knees tucked under, faces attentive. She told them the truth, not the whole of it, not yet but the shape of it, that they had been born outside the village, under snow and judgment, that the world had called them nameless, but she had named them anyway, that she had made them from nothing but thread and warmth and hope scraped from bark, that there would come a time soon when they would be asked to choose whether they want to stay hidden or to step into the wider world. She did not cry. She spoke plainly, the way women speak when there is no room left for softness. Elias was quiet for a long time. Then he reached for her hand. "Would you come with us?" She looked at him then, truly looked, and saw not a boy but the outline of a man beginning to take form. Brave, uncertain, already turned his face toward road she could not walk beside him. She shook her head. "No, my love, that road is yours." Fun didn't speak, but the stillness of his body told her he understood. The scouts returned the next morning. They did not knock. Maris stepped out before they reached the clearing and handed them 2 bundles, each containing a tunic, a pair of boots, a sealed note. She did not offer names. She only said, "They'll meet you at the edge of the vale, 1 hour before sunset, alone." The older scout studied her, perhaps searching for softness, perhaps weighing risk. Then he nodded. No more words were exchanged. That evening, she helped him dress. She brushed Elias's hair back with fingers that trembled when he wasn't looking. She fastened Finn's cloak with a brooch she had made from bone and copper wire. She packed dried fruit and salted meat in small satchels and tucked them against their ribs. She kissed each of their foreheads, as she had every night since they were born, and whispered names only she had ever used for them. One for mercy, one for silence. They did not cry. They did not ask for her to come. They only turned once at the edge of the trees and raised their hands in farewell. The wind caught their cloaks and lifted them slightly, as if even the forest knew to honor parting. She watched until they vanished between the trees, their shapes swallowed by dusk. Then she sat down on the cold step of the shack, the sky above her the color of worn slate, and let the silence fall around her like snow. Not empty, not final, but whole. Her sons were leaving, not because they had been taken, but because they had been found, and she had stitched them well enough to last. The seasons lost their names after the boys left. Maris no longer counted them in the usual way, no longer marked the first frost with extra kindling or tied ribbon to the branches when the snow finally melted. Instead, time was felt in absence, measured by the weight of the silence that lived in the corners of the shack, where once 2 voices had tangled and overlapped in every hour of the day. The quiet now was different than it had been in the beginning. Before, it had been a silence earned, protected, chosen. Now, it was a quiet that pressed too long on her chest and echoed in the hollows of the cabin, like a name spoken aloud in an empty room. She still rose each morning before the sun, lit the fire, boiled snow or spring water, depending on the time of year, and swept the dirt floor with her bristle brush made from pine. She still sewed, though more slowly. Her hands, once agile from necessity, had begun to stiffen, and there were mornings she had to soak them in warm water just to bend the fingers properly. But she kept sewing, even if fewer people came to trade. The forest was growing old with her. For a time, she would turn her head instinctively at every footfall, every echo of children's laughter carried from the distant fields, believing, just for the breath of a second, that it was Elias's bounding step or Fun's deliberate tread, but it never was. She knew they had gone where she could not follow, and she had sent them there. She had done what she once thought impossible, loosen her grip. Now she bore the consequences, quietly, like a wound hidden beneath clothing. She didn't speak to anyone for the first 3 weeks. She didn't need to. The forest understood. The trees remained, unchanged in their slow language of sway and root. She would walk the paths where the boys used to race sticks down the creek, or sit in the hollow where Elias had once strung a line of feathers between 2 low branches and declared a shrine to luck. The feathers had gone brittle and faded, some scattered to the wind. She replaced them with fresh ones, not to preserve the past, but to say, "I remember." At night, she dreamed them, but not always kindly. Sometimes, her mind replayed the moment of their leaving with cruel adjustments, Elias turning without looking back, Fun silent and stone-faced, the scouts leading them not into opportunity but into shadow. She would wake with her heart pounding, unsure whether the fear was prophecy or just the price of love stretched over distance. Other nights, the dreams were tender. She would see them as children again, curled beside her on the hearth, or splashing through a sun-warmed stream, laughing in that wild, unburdened way that no longer had place in her days. Waking from those dreams was worse. The ache afterward sat in her throat for hours. Weeks became months. Winter returned and passed. The forest shifted through its slow procession of color and decay. No word came. No messenger. No sign. She told herself this was good. No news meant safety. No news meant they were learning, growing, being shaped into men who would carry something of her into the world beyond. But each silence thickened with doubt. She thought of the court, the distant throne of stone and silk, where boys like hers might be praised for their intellect or scorned for their origins. She imagined noble women staring at the shape of Fun's mouth and wondering who had taught him to speak so carefully, or lords watching Elias move like fire and asking where his father had been. There were no answers for such questions, only marrow deep memory and the sound of a woman's hands working by candlelight. She began to speak to herself more, not aloud, but inwardly, holding silent conversations with the boys as she sewed. She would imagine Fun asking her about the stars, and she would explain which ones moved and which stayed, tracing the lines in the dark with her needle. She would imagine Elias laughing at one of her old songs, and she would hum it beneath her breath as she cleaned the hearth. These conversations became a ritual, not delusion, but preservation. She was not mad. She was mothering in absence. In early spring of the second year, something changed. A magpie began appearing at her windowsill, always at dawn, always alone. It pecked the wood frame, then left something, once a button carved from bone, another time a strip of ribbon she recognized as one she had sewn into Fun's collar. At first, she thought it coincidence, perhaps a trick of hope, but then the bird returned with a wax seal clutched in its foot, attached to a tightly folded square of parchment. The seal was royal, but cracked. The parchment bore no signature, only a few lines of unfamiliar but deliberate handwriting. "We are well. Forgive the silence. We remember. We miss the sky between the pines. Wait for us." The message was unsigned, but it needed no names. She reread the note until the edges wore down. She folded it into the lining of her shawl, carried it like a relic. For the first time in over a year, she lit a second candle at night. Not because she needed the light, but because it made the room feel less like a tomb. The magpie returned weekly, sometimes with small things, pressed petals, a sliver of gold ribbon, a bead carved in the shape of a sun. She never replied. She didn't know how. There was no address, no messenger to entrust. But she began leaving things on the sill in return. A sprig of thyme, a bit of red thread, a scrap of parchment on which she wrote only the word home. The bird always took them. In summer, she saw strangers near the edge of the trees again. These were not scouts, not men in uniform. They were dressed in merchant's garb, but they carried themselves like those used to being watched. One of them paused near the edge of the glade and looked toward the shack as though expecting something. Mara stepped outside slowly, not hostile but alert. The man did not approach. He only nodded once, as if confirming something to himself, and then turned and vanished down the trail. That night, She found a bolt of cloth tied to a stake near the path. Fine, pale blue silk, the likes of which had never touched her hands before. Folded inside it was a note, in a firmer hand than the last, shorter this time. We remember your fire. Soon. The word soon opened something in her. Not a wound, but a room, a space in her chest she had closed off in the long quiet. She sat beside the hearth that night and pulled out every stitch of cloth she had saved from their childhoods. The first swaddle cloth, a Biffin's old satchel strap, a blue ribbon Elias had once tied around a frog's leg before letting it go. She began to sew. Not garments, not trade goods, but something new, something whole. She did not yet know what it would be, only that her hands knew where to begin. She returned to old habits with cautious hope. She gathered berries. She dried herbs. She smoked meat and wove baskets. She sang again, softly, just enough to remember the sound of her own voice. When she walked past a stream where Elias had once caught fish with his bare hands, she knelt and placed her palm in the water. It was cold, sharp, real. The world still turned. And in its turning, perhaps the path might return her children to her, not as boys, not as the twin cries she had held beneath the church vestry, but as something fuller, something shaped by distance, but not lost to it. She understood more than ever that legacy was not a thing that came all at once. It was built slowly in silence, in stitch and ash and memory. It was not given. It was made. And even if no soul in the village ever uttered her name again, even if her children rose through courts and kingdoms as men of diplomacy and renown, they would carry her not as myth, but as marrow. The forest did not ask questions. It had no need to. It listened, as it always had, to her footsteps, to the breath she drew before each dawn, to the sound of her fingers pulling needle through cloth. She had loved them into the world with nothing but the heat of her body and the rhythm of her hands. And now, in the quiet, she kept loving them, not as hope, but as truth, not waiting in grief, but waiting in faith. It was in the third spring after their leaving that the letters began in earnest, not through post nor messenger, but by the same peculiar ritual that had first signaled their survival. A magpie arriving at dawn, its claws curled tight around a folded strip of parchment, wings flapping with the grace of a practiced courier. Maris had grown used to its rhythm by then. She would rise early and sit by the window with her tea cooling in its chipped tin mug, eyes on the treeline, waiting for the flash of black and white among the branches. The bird never came to her hand, never entered the shack, but always landed on the same corner of the windowsill, tapping once, twice, then dropping its parcel and vanishing as swiftly as it came. She never attempted to trap it or tame it. She understood the importance of things arriving by their own will. The letters came more frequently now, not full pages, but small fragments, thin, elegant paper, creased many times over, each one carrying a part of something larger, like pieces of tapestry slowly unfurling in reverse. They were written in Fun's hand, which had grown more certain with each missive. The boy who had once spoken rarely now wrote in long, deliberate sentences, choosing words with the same quiet precision that had marked his childhood movements. The ink was dark, often smeared at the edges, as if written by candlelight or during travel. He told her little of politics or court life. Instead, he wrote of sky and silence and the way the rain sounded when it struck the tiled roofs of the palace. He described the warmth of the southern light, the fruit trees that lined the courtyards, the way his brother, still restless and full of laughter, would speak 3 languages in one breath and charm the crown envoys with stories about pine sap and snowstorms. Elias's voice came less frequently on the page, but Fun always spoke of him. He told her how Elias had grown into his height, like a storm grows into itself, loud, sure, breathtaking. How he sang in the baths, argued with the scribes, and never once forgot the name of a bird or the way their mother hummed when she cooked. He said Elias was loved, even envied, by nobles who had never met a boy who knew how good a fish and quote the law in the same hour. Yet, beneath all the confidence, he wrote, Elias still woke sometimes in the early dark, saying the word home as though tasting something sweet and painful at once. Maris read those lines again and again, her hands trembling not from the cold but from the echo of something long folded away. It was in one of the letters Effin first asked for her forgiveness, not directly, not with desperation, but in a single line tucked between a description of the Queen's Court gardens and a passing mention of the sea. "I wish we had said goodbye differently," he wrote, "but I think you would have shattered us if you had wept. So thank you for not crying." She did not cry when she read it either, but she sat still for a long time afterward. The letter held to her chest, eyes fixed on a crack in the roof where the sun now entered like a blade each morning. She remembered that final hour as if it lived not in memory, but in muscle, the weight of Elias's cloak in her hands, the exact pitch of Fun's breath before he turned away. She remembered how heavy her arms had felt after they were gone, as if carrying them all those years had changed the shape of her. Each letter was carefully stored in a wooden box that once held her father's fishing tools, now lined with scraps of cloth and dried lavender. She read them by firelight, one by one, sometimes aloud, sometimes in silence, and occasionally replied, not in writing, but through the token she sent back with the bird. A swatch of blue linen sewn with their initials, a drawing of their old pine hollow, a dried violet tucked between paper with a faint trace of her soap scent. She did not know where the bird flew after it vanished, or how it found them across the miles and borders, but she trusted that it did. She trusted the strange magic of love's persistence. Then one morning, she found something different, a letter longer than any before, written not by Finn but Elias, in a script more bold than neat. It bore no formal greeting, no date, just her name at the top, as though he had whispered it before writing. He told her he had been chosen as an envoy, that both he and Finn would soon travel north as part of a diplomatic peace mission to settle a land dispute between two border provinces. Aldervale, he said, was along the way. They would not linger, but their passage would be public. There would be procession, ceremony, banners. He wrote it not as a warning, but as a gift. "If you stand among the trees, we will see you. If you do not, we will understand. But I wanted you to know we are coming home, if only through it." Maris read the letter 3 times before standing. Her legs felt uncertain, like a horse not yet ready to walk after winter. The forest around her had already begun to bloom, an early spring, tender and green at the edges, buds along the path and birds nesting low in the branches. She had no dress fine enough for a royal procession, no braid or jewel. She had only her hands, worn and wise, and the memory of the day she had first held them both, slick with birth and crying against her chest. She spent the next week preparing without speaking a word aloud. She washed her oldest shawl in rosemary and rainwater. She cut her hair herself, only the ends, smoothing it behind her ears with lavender oil. She stitched 2 cloaks, one deep gray, one sky blue, from the last bolts of good wool she had stored beneath the floorboards. The thread was her best, dyed with elderberries and iron, wound from her own distaff. She sewed not with haste, but with reverence, her fingers recalling each childhood coat, each tear patched after a fall, each hemline let down as their legs grew long. The day came bright and cold. She rose before light and walked the ridge where the procession was to pass. Already, the villagers were gathering, dressed in their market clothes, children sitting on fences, eyes wide with anticipation. She did not step into the crowd. She stood at the edge of the trees, half shadowed by a cluster of birch, where the ground still held the scent of old snow and sap. She wore no veil, only the shawl, the same color as the sky above, and around her neck she had tied the silver ring, the only piece left from the man who had given her the sons now returning. The procession was slow, ceremonial. Trumpets sounded in the distance and banners fluttered in the wind. Crimson and gold, the Queen's crest flanked by the sigil of the northern provinces. Horses clattered down the road, followed by carriages, then guards on foot, then the envoys. 2 men on horseback, riding side by side. Their posture was noble, effortless, their cloaks heavy with the weight of status. Yet she knew them in an instant. Elias wore his hair long, tied back in a velvet ribbon, his jaw sharp now, his frame broad and regal. He looked out over the crowd with ease, waving, smiling, but then his gaze shifted toward the trees. He slowed. Beside him, Finn rode quieter, his expression more composed, eyes scanning the ridge like a man searching for a constellation in daylight. When they saw her, they did not falter. They did not break form. But Elias raised his hand in a motion, not part of the ritual, a small, unpracticed wave, nothing regal about it. Finn bowed his head just slightly, eyes locked on hers. It lasted a heartbeat. 2. Then they were past. The crowd surged forward again, cheering, pointing. The procession carried on. Maris stood still long after they were gone. The wind picked up. Leaves rustled in last year's memory. Her arms ached to hold him again, but there was no sorrow in it now. No desperation. Only the quiet weight of recognition. They had seen her. They had returned to the world's eyes not as boys marked by shame, but as men of purpose, bearing their own names. When she turned back toward the shack, she walked slowly, not because she was tired, but because she understood that something sacred had passed between them, not in words, not in touch, but in presence, in witness. Her sons had come back into the village not to seek justice, not to reclaim a place once denied, but to let her see what she had made with nothing but her hands and her grief and her love. And now, no one, not the priest, not the law, not even time, could take that from her. The day after procession, the forest held its breath. The wind moved, but slower. The birds sang, but cautiously, as if they too had seen the cloaks ripple past and sense a change in the old rhythm. Maris felt it in her bones before her mind could name it. A hum beneath the surface of things, a shift not loud, but irrevocable. She did not rise at dawn as she usually did. She stayed in bed longer than she could remember. Curled beneath the patchwork quilt the boys had helped her sew years ago, when their stitches were uneven and their fingers still smelled of pine resin. She stared at the low ceiling and traced the wooden beams with her eyes, listening to the silence stretch between the walls. The fire had gone out. No te abrud, but she did not mind the cold. She was not waiting anymore. That afternoon, she stepped outside and stood for a long time with her bare feet pressed into the thawing earth, watching the path where they had passed. There was no sign left behind, no tracks, no echo, just a forest, quiet as always, reclaiming the shape of itself. She felt no bitterness, no hunger for more, but her hands ached with the weight of things not done, not spoken. She knew their return, however brief, had broken open something within her. Not sorrow, not joy, but a space. And in that space, something had begun to breathe again. They came at dusk. She did not hear horses, no trumpets or footsteps or shouts of heralds, only a knock, soft and uncertain, on the door of the shack that had not seen visitors in over a decade. Her first instinct was to freeze, as she once had when wolves had come too close to the edge of the garden. Her second was to open the door without delay, as she would have if either of the boys had cried out in the night. When she did open it, the world seemed to still around the edges of the frame. Finn stood first, his silhouette outlined in the fading gold of forest sunset, his cloak thrown back, the same bone brooch she had fastened still pinned to his shoulder. He was taller than she remembered, his features carved sharper now, but his eyes were the same, gray and steady, like still water under ice. He did not smile, not yet. He only looked at her, then stepped aside. Elias was behind him, half laughing, half breathless, as if he'd run the last stretch from the road. He had mud on his boots and leaves caught in the edge of his cloak, but he looked unchanged in the ways that mattered. His eyes, bright with feeling, found hers instantly. "We had to," he said before she could speak. "The road goes on, but we couldn't pass through without coming back." Maris said nothing. Her throat tightened. The sound of their voices, no longer imagined, was almost too much. She stepped back to let them in. The shack had not grown any larger. If anything, it seemed to shrink with their presence. Two grown men now inside a space built for a woman and her sons, one so small they fit together by the fire with room to spare. But neither complained. Finn ducked to avoid the low beam. Elias brushed cobwebs from the hearth corner without flinching. They sat on the same stools they'd built when they were 12, legs now too long, knees bent awkwardly, and still they fit, because they belonged. She boiled water without asking, set out the chipped mugs, and reached for the tin of dried herbs she'd saved for such a moment, though she'd never let herself believe it would come. The tea was bitter, unflavored, but none of them seemed to mind. The silence between them was not empty. It was full. It stretched and held and breathed. Elias broke it first. "You haven't changed," he said, his voice quieter now. "This place, everything's the same. It even smells like us." Maris allowed herself a small smile. "It smells like wood smoke and wet leaves. The rest is memory." Finn reached into a satchel and withdrew a small package wrapped in cloth. He placed it on the table, without ceremony. "Letters," he said. "All the ones we wrote but couldn't send. Some came back. Others were taken for inspection. But I kept copies." Maris touched the bundle gently. It was heavy, tied with twine. She did not open it. Not yet. She looked at her sons instead. "You were never truly gone," she said. "I carried every word you hadn't written." They spoke deep into the evening. The light faded, and the fire burned low, and still they did not leave. They told her the court, of long corridors of marble, of rooms too cold despite their beauty, of the way some nobles spoke as though the wind itself might bow to them. Elias told stories with his hands, mimicking the accent of courtiers, and Maris laughed, not loudly, not freely, but in the way of someone who has not laughed aloud in years and finds a sound unfamiliar in her own mouth. Finn spoke more carefully, sparing the darker parts, but she caught the between the sentences, the tension in his jaw when he described negotiations, the way his eyes shifted when Elias mentioned the Queen's advisors. These were not boys. These were men made of weight and compromise, their edges smooth and sharpened by distant power. And yet, beneath it all, they were hers. They did not stay the night. Elias wanted to, he asked twice, but Finn reminded him of the schedule, the guards, the formalities that came with rank. They could only bend so many rules. When they stood to leave, Maris did not cry. She had promised herself she would not. She wrapped 2 small bundles, one for each, containing cured meat, dried apples, and a bit of sweetbread she had made just in case. She slipped the cloak she had sewn around their shoulders again, fixing the folds, straightening the lines, brushing off the dust of her hearth from the seams. Elias hugged her fiercely, without words, his arms wrapped around her like he still believed she could keep out the cold. He pulled back only to kiss her forehead. "We'll come again," he said, not just to pass through, to stay. Finn held her hand longer. He did not embrace her, but his thumb brushed over her wrist, the same spot he had once cut as a boy trying to sharpen a knife. "Thank you," he said, "for not making us choose." When they left, it was quiet. No procession, no trumpets, only the hush of night and the whisper of branches overhead. Maris stood in the doorway and watched until the woods swallowed them again, as they had once before. But this time, they were not boys vanishing into the unknown. They were men returning to it, with the knowledge of home carried behind their eyes like light stored in a lantern. She returned to her chair and sat by the fire. The bundle of letters sat on the table, untouched. She did not open it yet. She let the silence settle again, but now it was different. It had shape. It had memory. The door had opened. The voices had returned. And though the shack was still only 4 walls and a fire, it had become, in that evening, something wider. A place not of exile, but of return. Outside, the trees swayed gently. The forest no longer held its breath. It exhaled slowly, like a mother letting go not of her sons, but the fear that they might never look back. The church at the heart of Aldervale had changed its face since the winter Maris was cast out. Once gray with weather and overgrowth, the stone facade was now whitewashed and newly pointed. The bell repaired, its toll clearer, more precise. The heavy doors had been replaced with lacquered pine, the iron handles polished to a bright gleam. Flowers lined the steps and wooden planters, and inside, new tapestries hung like softened commandments. There was no visible trace of what had happened beneath its roof all those years ago. No stain, no record. But memory lingered like a breath held too long, invisible and inescapable. The morning the boys returned to the church, the air carried a tension unlike any festival or wedding day. It was not a holy day by the calendar's measure, but the village had gathered all the same, drawn by the news that the Queen's envoys, the brothers who had once been born here under shrouded shame, were returning to speak before the altar. No summons had been issued, no trumpets had sounded, and yet the square had filled shoulder to shoulder with villagers and passers-by, and even the priest, standing stiffly near the steps with his hands folded over his stomach like he hoped to shield himself from something more than wind. Maris had arrived before dawn. She had stood behind the chapel wall, just beyond view, wrapped in her oldest cloak. She did not enter the crowd. She did not wish to be seen, not yet. Her feet remembered the weight of those same stones, the curve of the path she had taken when fleeing with newborns in her arms. Her head lowered, her ears full of whispers that still rang in her dreams. She had not set foot near the chapel since, but the ground did not reject her. It was only still. The brothers arrived not in carriages or beneath banners, but on foot. They had dismissed their escort at the edge of the village and walked the remaining distance side by side, their cloaks trailing, their steps unhurried. Elias bore a folded document under his arm, bound with twine. Fun carried nothing but a small leather satchel. Their expressions were not angry, not triumphant, but composed, like men returning not for vengeance, but for truth. When they reached the base of the steps, the villagers parted. Some nodded stiffly. Others turned their faces away. A few whispered their names as if testing the syllables aloud. Maris watched from her shadowed place. Her breath caught, her hands clasped tight before her. The priest cleared his throat and stepped forward, a smile carved into his face with careful restraint. "Welcome, sirs. It is the joy to see Aldervale honored in your presence." Elias looked at him, not unkindly, but without warmth. "You may call us by name. It's where this began, isn't it? Names denied." The priest's smile flickered. "Indeed, I believe the past has much to teach us, and we've all grown." Fun's voice cut through gently. "We're not here for platitudes." He stepped forward, past the priest, and onto the first stone step. His voice, when he spoke again, was low and clear, and it carried through the courtyard not by force, but by weight. Once, a woman came to these steps asking for blessing. She had borne her children in silence, in exile, because she was told she was unworthy of this house. She was refused, branded unclean, sent into the snow with 2 lives clinging to her skin. He turned and looked at the crowd, his eyes sweeping across faces now lowered. "We lived, not because of grace from this place, but because of her, because she gave everything, because she made a world where there was none. And now, the same church that condemned her." He stopped, his voice breaking just slightly at the edges. Elias stepped forward then, unfolding the parchment he had carried. It was a decree, drawn by the Queen's own hand, bearing 3 seals. "This," he said, "is the official revocation of the edict passed in Aldervale 20 years ago. The law that permitted the exile of mothers bearing children out of wedlock without inquiry, without aid, without recourse." He looked not at the priest, but at the people. "It is void, and it will not be remembered in law, only in story." He set the parchment down on the step and took a candle from the nearest sconce. The flame was small, flickering against the morning light. He knelt, placed a candle beneath the scroll, and watched as the fire took root. The parchment blackened, curled inward. Smoke rose, faint and fragrant. Not angry, not dramatic, simply final. No one moved. The village held still. Then, from the edge of the crowd, someone stepped forward, a woman, older now. Perhaps the baker's wife once. Perhaps a face Maris had seen only in passing years ago. She took a candle from her bag and lit it from the dying flame. She placed it on the step beside the ashes. Others followed. Not many. A few. Enough. A young boy placed a sprig of thyme. An elder set down a length of twine. Small offerings. Symbols of repair, of recognition. No words were exchanged. Only the quiet language of shared breath. Maris stepped forward last. No one noticed her at first. She moved slowly, her step steady, her face calm. Her hands held a piece of fabric, pale, hand-stitched, bearing the same pine and needle mark she had sewn into the hems of the boys' first cloaks. She knelt on the step where the scroll had burned and laid the cloth there, pressing it into the soot. It came away smudged. She did not mind. Elias turned. Their eyes met. He stepped toward her, not rushing, not claiming the moment, only meeting it. He opened his arms. She entered them. No titles, no speeches, only this. a mother and her sons, standing not in a house that once cast them out, but beside it, in the open air, where truth breathed freely. Finn stood behind them, eyes closed for a moment. When he opened them, he looked at the priest, who had remained motionless throughout. "This place will change," he said, "or it will fall." It was not a threat. It was prophecy. That night, candles burned along the chapel steps long after the crowd had gone. Maris returned to the shack alone, but the silence there had changed. It was not emptier, not heavier. It was wider. It echoed differently. She lit her own candle and placed it in the center of the table. Around it, she laid 3 stones, one for her, one for each of them. The hearth was warm. The floor swept. The wind outside no longer carried the old weight. She sat and looked at her hands, still bearing the ash smudge of the church step. She did not wash it off. She let it remain. The past had not been erased, but it had been named. And in naming, something had been released, not only for her, but for those who had watched and known and said nothing. The shame no longer belonged to her. It never had. In the stillness, the flame danced. Outside, a night board called low and steady. And for the first time in many years, Maris did not feel hidden. She felt seen. The meadow lay beyond the village, quiet and wide and sloped with a gentle descent that caught the late sun in long golden arcs. It had no name on the map, no markers carved by men, but Maris had known it since she was a child. She had once wandered here in secret, before her belly had begun to swell, before the frost and the banishment, when she still dared to dream of freedom in the rhythm of her own footsteps. Back then, the wild heather grew tall, reaching to her waist in violet haze, and the wind moved through it like a river of whispers. She had come here to think, to ache, to hope in silence. Now, all these years later, her son stood there beside her, their shadows stretching across the tall grass, and the weight of time came pressing down like the sky had leaned in just a watch. Elias held a small spade in one hand and a bundle wrapped in gray linen in the other. Finn stood beside him, arms crossed, his face unreadable but not closed. He had brought stones, 3, smooth and flat, chosen from the creek behind the shack, and scrubbed until their pale surfaces gleamed faintly under the evening light. Maris stood a few steps apart from them, her hands folded at her waist, her cloak loose over her shoulders. Her hair, streaked now with gray, caught the wind and moved like threads of silver ink against her cheek. No one spoke at first. There was no need to. Words had already been said at the chapel. This place was not for speech. This was for naming. The boys had asked her where she would want to mark their beginning. She had answered with only this place. Not because it was sacred, but because it was honest. There had been no stone to mark their birth, no witness but her breath and the frost and the walls of a ruined vestry. If there was to be memory now, she wanted it here, not in the village, not in the church. Here, where shame had never entered, where judgment had no footing. Elias kneeled first, pushing back the sleeves of his tunic. The linen bundle he placed in the grass beside him, and then he began to dig. The soil was soft with spring, damp and pliant beneath his hands. He did not rush. With each motion, he seemed to be searching for something deeper than roots, something lost in the grain of the earth. Maris watched the way his shoulders moved, the strength in him now, so different from the thin, shivering child she had once wrapped in scraps of wool and warmed with her breath. When the hole was deep enough, he sat back on his heels and looked up at her. Maris stepped forward. From a fold of her cloak, she drew a narrow strip of cloth, faded blue, the same color as the sky had been the morning they were born. It was part of the swaddling she had once sewn by hand, the last piece remaining. She had kept it all these years, tucked into the lining of her satchel, folded and refolded until the edges had frayed. She placed it gently into the hollow, laying it flat like a memory being pressed back into soil. Finn knelt beside his brother and placed the first stone on top of the cloth. The second followed. The third he left resting in his palm for a moment longer, then set it down with care. They did not speak names aloud, but each of them knew what had been buried there. Birth, pain, exile, beginning. A mother and 2 sons, cast out and made again, forged not in violence but in devotion. This was not a grave. It was a cradle turned to stone. Elias reached into the bundle and removed a thin strip that would carve with their initials, MEF. He pressed into the soil just behind the stones so that it stood upright like a tiny post, bare and unadorned. No taites, no dates, only the initials carved by his own hand, steady and straight. No one else needs to know, he said quietly, but we will always come back here. Maris nodded. She felt her throat tighten but did not let it break her. You already carry it with you. That's all I ever hoped. The wind moved through the heather, brushing the stalks against their legs like a sigh. Finn looked out over the hills, his eyes catching on the distant tree line. When I was small, he said, I used to dream of this place without knowing it was real. I thought it was just a dream where things felt quiet, safe. He looked back at her. It was always here, wasn't it? Even when we couldn't see it. Yes, Maris said, like most things that matter. They stayed until the sun dipped low enough to turn the sky into a sheet of rose and copper. The meadow glowed, alive with color and quiet, and the three of them stood together as though anchored in time. Elias spoke softly of court affairs, of distant lands and strange customs, of noblemen who had never seen snow and envoys who had never known hunger. He spoke not to impress, but to offer his life to her in pieces, as if saying, this is what I made from what you gave. Finn said less, but each word landed with purpose. He had taken to diplomacy with a tact and patience that surprised no one who had known him as a child. He worked in silences and unspoken things, in gestures and translations. Maris knew the world would trust him before they understood him. She did not fear for him. She pitied those who underestimated him. Before they left, she placed her hand on each of their faces, not as a blessing, not as farewell, simply to feel them. Their skin was warm from the sun, their jaws rough now with stubble. She had never kissed them in public before, not since they were children, but now she did, softly, once on each cheek. They did not flinch. They received it like something sacred, like something remembered. They walked her back to the edge of the village where the trees began, where the forest still stood as a silent guardian of all the years they had lost and reclaimed. At the path, they stopped. Their horses waited a few lengths away, tethered loosely to a branch. They would leave before nightfall, ride back toward the capital, toward Judy's and O's and the weight of names larger than the ones they were born with. Elias hesitated. You don't have to stay here, he said. We can make a place for you. Anywhere. The Queen would grant land. A house. You've earned. But Maris shook her head before he could finish. This is my place. I built it when nothing else wanted me. It knows me, and it's enough. Finn didn't try to convince her otherwise. He only nodded. We'll return again. And when we do, we'll stay longer. She smiled at that. Not too long. I like the quiet. They embraced once more, and then she watched them mount their horses and ride into the dusk. She stood until they were gone, the dust settling in their wake. Then she turned and walked back the long, familiar way to her shack, her steps slow, her breath steady. That night, she lit a fire not for warmth, but for presence. The shack glowed from within, casting shadows on the trees. She sat at the table and laid out a new piece of linen. With fresh thread, she began to embroider the shape of 3 stones in a field of wildflowers. Not a monument, not a message, just a mark, stitched from memory, meant for no one's eyes but her own. Outside, in the meadow, the heather swayed under the moon. The wood marker caught the starlight. The stones did not move, but beneath them lay the story of a birth not recorded, a shame transformed, a name reclaimed, not by law, but by love. The winter that followed was the gentlest in years. The snow came late, in soft, hesitant flurries that dusted the pines without burying them, and the river behind the shack did not freeze until after solstice. Maris noticed a change not just in the weather, but in the rhythm of the forest itself. The wind no longer groaned through the trees in mourning, but whistled low, curious and alive. The animals returned sooner. Birds nested closer to clearing, and for the first time in many winters, a fox crossed her path without running. It was as if the forest had exhaled, as if the years of silence and loss had lifted just enough to let something else take root. Peace, perhaps, Not the peace promised by kings or decrees, but the kind that grows from within, slow and stubborn, like ivy finding stone. She had grown older, though she rarely thought about age and years. Her joints ached more in the morning. Her fingers stiffened with the cold, but she moved with purpose, and her breath still came strong. The boys had returned to their lives in the capital, but their absence now carried a different weight. It was no longer the echo of fear or the ache of abandonment. It was a fullness that remained even when they were gone. They wrote to her now through proper means, sealed letters, carried by trusted riders who left their parcels in a crook of the old birch by the path. She never read them right away. She liked to place them beside the hearth, let them warm in the fire's glow, as if softening the paper might ease her heart for what it carried. The letters were filled with stories of courtly debates, of border negotiations, of cold nights on a road and feasts lit by crystal chandeliers. Elias wrote with heat, as if the ink could not keep up with his mind. His words burst across the page, uneven and full of color. Fun's letters came less often, but when they did, they were long and still, written in straight lines with no crossings out. He told her things others would not have, the long silences between council decisions, the tension behind ceremonial smiles, the names of the children of the queen, and how they had taken to Elias like birds to seed. He told her the truth, not just of where they were, but of who they were becoming. And then, as spring returned again, a new rhythm began. Strangers arrived at her clearing, not many, and never without cause. At first, it was a woman from the northern coast who had heard that the mother of the royal envoys knew how to mend boots, so they never leaked again. Then a young couple whose daughter had been cast out of their village and needed a place to rest before continuing south. Maris did not ask how they found her. The forest had ways of guiding those who listened. She offered tea, fire, and space. She let them speak or not. She did not preach or instruct. She only listened and stitched and shared her bread. Over time, word spread that there was a woman in the woods who asked nothing and gave only what she had: thread, stories, silence, rest. Children began to come, too, not alone, but with weary mothers, with aunts and grandmothers who had heard that the woman with ash-gray hair and the voice like softened wool could teach them how to make things last. She showed them how to patch sleeves, how to card wool, how to find warmth in bark and moss and boiled pine needles. She did not tell them of her past unless they asked. And even then, she spoke simply. "I loved two boys so much, I let them go," she would say. And they returned with enough light to scatter what tried to bury us. One child asked if she was a queen. The others laughed, but she only smiled and said, "No, but I am the mother of men who sit at tables where laws are shaped. And that is something." Another time, a girl no older than 10 asked why her hands were always moving, even when she was quiet. Maris looked down at her fingers and said, "Because the world unraveled me once, and now I sew it back together a little at a time." She stitched during storms. She stitched during harvest. She stitched even when there was nothing to mend, not out of compulsion, but out of habit, reverence. Her hands remembered the years before the boys could speak, when sewing was the only way to keep the silence from breaking her. Now it was a rhythm of prayer. Each thread pulled through cloth was a remembrance. Each hem turned was an answer to a question no one had asked aloud. She no longer feared being forgotten. She understood now that love, once made real, outlasted the body that bore it. The shack, once sagging and gray, had become something of a beacon. The roof had been patched, the walls scrubbed, herbs hung from the rafters in neat bundles, and the fire was never without flame. She grew a garden now, wild and unshaped, full of lavender and thistle and whatever else took root when left alone. She did not seek to tame it. She let it grow as she had grown, stubborn, resilient, unexpected. Then, one morning, years after the fire at the church steps and stone laid in the meadow, the sound of horses returned to the edge of the woods. She knew before she saw them. She had felt it in her sleep, a stirring, like the moment before a bird lifts into the air. She stepped outside and waited, apron still tied, hands damp from the basin. Elias and Finn rode side by side, their clothes plain, their hair touched now with silver at the edges. They looked like men who had done hard things, who had laughed deeply, who had lost and learned and loved. They dismounted without a word and walked to her. She held them both, their arms folded around her like walls she had once built from nothing but bone and breath. They stayed for days. They chopped wood, dug new rows in the garden, repaired the door. At night, they sat beside her as she stitched. She did not ask if they were staying for good. She knew their lives stretched far beyond her clearing. But they spoke of land nearby, of a house they might build, of a place for meetings where things could be said without fear. They spoke of legacy, not as title, but as offering. Before they left again, she handed them each a cloak newly sewn. The fabric dyed with alder bark and lined with the soft wool of the lamb she now kept. On the hems, she had stitched a single word, one each of them would carry. For Elias, fire. For Fun, root. They did not ask why. They only understood. The next spring, a stone was placed beside the one in the meadow, unmarked, but laid with ceremony. Villagers had come quietly, no longer in fear or shame, but with basket of food and small candles. They did not pretend to erase what had happened, but they came, and that, Maris knew, was how change began, not in the rewriting of history, but in the quiet rewriting of response. Years passed, the seasons turned, the forest grew, the shack aged, Maris aged, and when her time came, she did not resist it. She lay down one evening beneath her patched quilt, the wind soft outside, the fire steady, the last letter from her sons tucked beneath her pillow. She did not speak a final word. She had said everything in thread. They buried her beside the meadow stones, beneath the heather, with no marker but a shawl folded neatly atop the grave. Those who came after knew where to find it. The shack remained, not as a ruin, but as a place of return. A place where stories were sown and silence held no punishment. A place where a woman once lived who turned exile into sanctuary, shame into seed, grief into legacy. And though her voice no longer filled the rooms and her hands no longer stitched through dusk, the fire she lit never went out. It lived on, carried in the cloaks of her sons, in the hands of the children she taught, in the songs hummed beside hearths that would never again cast anyone into the cold.